What if I told you that the modern-day Israel you see on the map may not be the same Israel the Bible talks about? What if everything you thought you knew about Israel was only part of the story? Most people, including many Christians, believe that the modern state of Israel, founded in 1948, is the direct continuation of the Israel we read about in the Bible. They see it as the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham and his descendants, and therefore many believe they must support it unconditionally. But what if I told you that the Israel on the map today isn't necessarily the same as the Israel God talked about in the Bible? Here's a fact that may surprise you. The modern state of Israel is largely secular. It's driven by political forces and nationalistic ideologies, and many of its leaders do not follow God as their forefathers once did. And yet, Christians around the world stand by Israel with a kind of blind allegiance, convinced that supporting this nation is the same as standing with God's plan. This isn't just about geography. This is about spiritual identity. And the differences between the biblical Israel and the modern nation are far deeper than you may realize. The truth is that God's promise to Abraham was not just about a physical land. It was about a covenant relationship. And today, while many in Israel claim the inheritance of Abraham, the question remains, are they living in alignment with the covenant God established? Stay with me until the end, because we're going to explore questions that could completely shift your understanding of the Israel we see today. Who are the Zionists, and how did they shape modern Israel? What does the Bible say about the land promised to Abraham? And perhaps the most shocking question, is it right for Christians to support everything modern Israel does, regardless of their actions? The answers may not be comfortable, but they're necessary. What you're about to learn will give you a biblical perspective on the current Israel, the spiritual implications of supporting it, and how these revelations relate to biblical prophecy. To understand the present, we must first go back to the beginning, to the story of Abraham in the Old Testament. In Genesis 15:18-21, God promised Abraham a specific land for his descendants. This land, known as Canaan, spans modern-day Israel, but also parts of Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and Egypt. It was a broad territory, much larger than the borders of the current state of Israel. However, there's a key point to understand. The land was tied to a covenant. It wasn't just a territory for the sake of territory. It was a land where God's people were to live in obedience to him. This land, Israel, was meant to reflect God's relationship with his people. It was never just about real estate. It was about spiritual alignment. Now, the modern state of Israel, founded in 1948, came into existence after World War II, largely through international political agreements and the Zionist movement. While many Jews returned to the land, seeing it as the fulfillment of prophecy, others argue that the modern state of Israel is a secular nation, a far cry from the theocratic nation that God envisioned in the Old Testament. So does today's Israel fulfill the promise God made to Abraham. It's not as clear-cut as it seems. While the geography may overlap, the spiritual purpose of Israel in the Bible was tied to obedience and covenant. The modern state is political, secular, and often driven by nationalism, not biblical devotion. Another turning point in the biblical story comes with Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. In Genesis 32:28, God changes Jacob's name to Israel after Jacob wrestles with an angel. The name means he who struggles with God, and it's from Jacob that the 12 tribes of Israel descend. But here's the critical question. When God changed Jacob's name to Israel, was he referring to a physical territory, or was he creating a people, a spiritual lineage. The Bible suggests that Israel isn't just a nation-state, but a people chosen by God. In Exodus 19:5-6, God tells Moses, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Israel was to be a holy nation, a people in relationship with God. Therefore, the name Israel was less about land and more about the covenant people of God. The land was a gift, yes, but the real significance of Israel was their relationship with God. So, while the modern state of Israel might occupy the land, the question remains, are they living as the covenant people of God? That's what truly defined biblical Israel, and it's what we must consider when comparing the ancient nation with today's state. To understand the creation of modern Israel, you need to understand Zionism. Zionism is a political movement that emerged in the late 19th century, advocating for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This movement gained momentum due to anti-Semitism in Europe and the persecution of Jews throughout history. But here's something that's often misunderstood. Zionism wasn't always religious. Many early Zionists were secular Jews who were more focused on the cultural and political identity of the Jewish people than on their spiritual covenant with God. Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, envisioned a secular state where Jews could live freely, away from the oppression they faced in Europe. This brings us to today. The modern state of Israel is largely controlled by secular political leaders. While there are religious factions within Israel, the nation's government and much of its population are not driven by Torah-based principles. Instead, they focus on national security, political power, and maintaining their sovereignty in a volatile region. So, when we ask who controls Israel today, we must acknowledge that Zionism and its political goals are a significant driving force. This raises another important question for Christians. Are we supporting a biblical Israel or a political Israel? There's often confusion about whether the people who control modern Israel are the same as those who rejected and crucified Jesus. Historically speaking, Jesus lived during the time of the Roman Empire, and his crucifixion was the result of both Jewish religious leaders and Roman authority. The religious leaders at the time, primarily the Pharisees and Sadducees, were responsible for condemning Jesus. But it's important to remember that not all Jews rejected Jesus. His earliest followers, including Peter, John, and Paul, were all Jewish. The people who live in modern Israel today are descendants of the ancient Israelites, but many are secular and do not follow religious Judaism as strictly as their ancestors. Moreover, the Roman Empire, which played a significant role in Jesus' crucifixion, no longer exists. So, the short answer is no. The people who crucified Jesus are not the same as the secular Israelis living in the modern state today. However, it's important to note that many Jewish people still do not accept Jesus as the Messiah, which continues the spiritual divide between Judaism and Christianity. Many Christians believe they must support the modern state of Israel unconditionally because of verses like Genesis 12:3, where God says to Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse." This verse is often interpreted to mean that blessing Israel, in whatever form it takes, brings God's favor. But should Christians support every action taken by the Israeli government, regardless of whether it aligns with God's word? The reality is that the modern state of Israel is often involved in military actions, political conflicts, and policies that may not reflect biblical principles. For instance, the Palestinian conflict raises ethical and moral questions about human rights, land occupation, and justice. While it's important to pray for Israel and acknowledge its biblical significance, Christians should also remember that God's heart is for justice, peace, and righteousness. Supporting Israel does not mean turning a blind eye to actions that go against these values. Jesus himself said in Matthew 5:9, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." As Christians, our role is to seek God's will, not to support any nation unconditionally, but to advocate for justice and truth in all things. Another pressing question: is modern Israel under constant threat from its neighbors, or is Israel itself a threat to the stability of the Middle East? Historically, Israel has been involved in multiple wars since its creation in 1948, including conflicts with Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. Israel is surrounded by nations that have, at various times, sought its destruction, such as Iran, which has openly called for the annihilation of Israel. At the same time, Israel's military actions, such as the occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza, have led to accusations that Israel is destabilizing the region and contributing to the suffering of Palestinian civilians. The truth is, Israel is both under threat and a regional power. The conflict is complex, and as Christians, we must look beyond political narratives and seek God's wisdom in understanding the situation. Our goal should always be to pray for peace and justice for all people in the region, not to take a one-sided political stance. Finally, let's address the issue of Zionism and its influence on Western media, Hollywood, and US politics. Many people, including public figures like Kanye West, have claimed that Zionists have significant control over global narratives and political agendas. It's true that Israel has strong ties with the United States, and that Jewish people hold significant positions in media, entertainment, and finance. However, it's important not to fall into conspiracy theories that promote anti-Semitic stereotypes. The influence of Zionism is real, but it's a political movement, not a spiritual conspiracy. Many Jews, especially in the US, do have strong connections with Israel, and Western governments, particularly the US, have been staunch supporters of Israel since its founding. As Christians, we should focus on the biblical truths and avoid falling into political traps or anti-Semitic rhetoric. The real question is, how can we be peacemakers in a world where politics and faith often collide? Finally, we must ask, does the current war in Israel have anything to do with biblical prophecy? Are we getting closer to the end times? Many theologians point to passages in Ezekiel 38-39 and Revelation that speak of wars involving Israel in the last days. Ezekiel describes a massive invasion of Israel by a coalition of nations, which some believe includes Russia and Iran. This war, often referred to as the War of Gog and Magog, is seen as a precursor to the second coming of Christ. While it's possible that the current conflicts in Israel are setting the stage for these prophetic events, Jesus reminds us in Matthew 24:6, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come." In other words, while we should be watchful, we should not live in fear. God's plan will unfold in His time, and our role is to be faithful, prayerful, and committed to spreading the gospel. The modern state of Israel is a complex blend of history, politics, and spiritual significance. While it occupies the land that was promised to Abraham, it is not the same biblical Israel governed by God's covenant. The nation today is largely secular, driven by political forces rather than spiritual obedience. As Christians, we must approach the situation with discernment. While Israel plays a critical role in biblical prophecy, We should not offer unconditional support for any nation that acts outside of God's will. Our allegiance is to Christ and his teachings of justice, peace, and righteousness. The current wars in Israel may indeed have prophetic significance, but our focus should be on living in faith, remaining rooted in Scripture, and seeking truth in a world filled with conflicting narratives. In the end, God's plan for Israel and the world will be fulfilled.